steam rising from the metal tray caught Private Ichiro Tanaka by surprise, carrying with it a scent he had nearly forgotten. Real beef, simmered to tenderness, not the dried fish or occasional horse meat that had been the luxury of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Around him, fellow Japanese prisoners shuffled forward in the chow line at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, their expressions caught between hunger and suspicion. It was March 1945, and for men who had been prepared to die rather than surrender, this moment represented something far more unsettling than mere captivity. It was their first encounter with American abundance, a glimpse into a reality that contradicted everything they had been told about their enemy. The ladle descended again, adding another generous portion to Ichiro's tray. When was the last time he had seen this much meat in one place? And why would their captors, their sworn enemies, feed them better than their own military had? What kind of war was this, where prisoners ate better than soldiers? Just 4 months earlier, Ichiro had been a radio operator on Peleliu, crouched in a coral cave as American forces methodically captured the island. His commanding officer had assembled the surviving men as the perimeter collapsed. "Remember," the captain had shouted, his voice tight with emotion, "surrender brings only shame and torture. Choose an honorable death." Many had followed these words to their end, charging American positions or taking their own lives. But Ichiro, knocked unconscious by an explosion, had awakened to find himself in American hands, denied even the dignity of choosing his fate. The weeks that followed had unfolded like a fever dream. Field hospitals where his wounds were cleaned with antiseptics he'd never seen before, holding camps where he received daily meals of rice and beans, and eventually a transport ship bound for the American mainland. Throughout this journey, the Japanese prisoners remained tense, suspicious, waiting for the cruelty to begin. "They fatten us for information or slave labor," an older sergeant whispered during the crossing, his voice barely audible above the ship's engines. "My cousin fought in China. We gave our prisoners only water and rice husks. The Americans will be worse." Instead, as the ship made its way across the Pacific, the prisoners received regular meals, not feasts, but portions that seemed inexplicably generous given their status. Medical personnel treated their ailments with supplies that appeared inexhaustible. Guards, while vigilant, did not beat or abuse them. This contradiction between expectation and reality left many prisoners disoriented, clinging to the belief that the true punishment must still be waiting on American soil. When Ichiro first stepped through the gates of Camp Shelby, the processing procedure intensified this dissonance. After disembarking from trains, prisoners were directed through a series of stations: registration, medical examination, delousing, uniform distribution. The efficiency was almost mechanical. Each man received a complete set of clothing: underwear, socks, boots, and warm jackets for the spring weather. The items were plain but clean and sturdy, far better than the tattered uniforms many had worn during their final battles. At each step, Ichiro exchanged guarded glances with his fellow prisoners, their suspicion mounting with every unexpected comfort. When would the mask drop? When would the Americans reveal their true intentions? And then came that first meal in the camp mess hall, the moment that would fracture their understanding of the enemy in ways that propaganda and battlefield losses never could. What awaited them beyond those mess hall doors would challenge everything they thought they knew about America, about scarcity, and about the nature of power itself. The mess hall doors swung open to reveal long tables arranged in neat rows, with a serving line staffed by American personnel and prisoner workers. The room buzzed with the clatter of cutlery and murmuring voices. What caught the prisoners' attention immediately was the smell. Rich, meaty, substantial, so different from the sparse aromas of field kitchens they had known. As they moved through the line, each man received portions that seemed wasteful in their abundance. Beef stew with visible chunks of meat, potatoes, bread, butter, and even a slice of cake for dessert. Most shocking of all was the milk. Actual fresh milk in quantities that would have been reserved for officers or hospital patients in the Japanese military. Ichiro stood frozen before his filled tray, unable to reconcile what he saw with what he had been taught to expect. The man behind him nudged him forward impatiently. Finding a seat at the edge of a long table, Ichiro watched as his fellow prisoners reacted to this first taste of American captivity. Some ate ravenously, shoveling food into their mouths as though it might be snatched away. Others picked suspiciously at their trays, convinced the food must be poisoned. A few even refused to eat at all, their pride or fear overcoming their hunger. Captain Hiroshi Matsumoto, once a respected officer from Tokyo, sat rigidly across from Ichiro, his eyes darting between his tray and the American guards. "It must be some trick," he whispered. "Perhaps they fatten us before using us for medical experiments." But as the days passed and meals continued to arrive with the same abundance, such fears began to sound increasingly hollow. The routines of camp life established themselves. Wake-up calls, roll calls, work assignments, 3 meals daily, recreation time, lights out. And through it all, the food remained consistent. Breakfast with eggs and bacon, lunches with sandwiches and fruit, dinners with meat, vegetables, and dessert. For men who had grown accustomed to the increasing deprivation of Japan's wartime diet, where rice was stretched with other grains and meat had become a rare luxury, this daily abundance was more disorienting than any interrogation technique could have been. When rain fell one afternoon, soaking prisoners returning from a work detail, they were met not with indifference, but with dry clothes and hot coffee. In these small moments of unexpected consideration, cracks began to form in the armor of their beliefs, hairline fractures in the certainty that had carried them into battle. As spring deepened and the Mississippi landscape bloomed with colors, these cracks widened into chasms that no imperial doctrine could bridge. The true shock was not that they were prisoners, but that captivity in America looked nothing like the desperate struggle they had been told to expect. What other lies might they have been told about this enemy who fed them better than their own army ever had? The contrast between expectation and reality became starker as the weeks passed. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, a weathered veteran of campaigns in the Philippines, often lingered at the mess hall window, watching American supply trucks arrive. Each delivery brought crates of fresh vegetables, sacks of flour, sides of beef, cartons of milk, and other provisions that seemed to flow in endless supply. The contrast between expectation and reality became starker as the weeks passed. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, a weathered veteran of campaigns in the Philippines, often lingered at the mess hall window, watching American supply trucks arrive. Each delivery brought crates of fresh vegetables, sacks of flour, sides of beef, cartons of milk, and other provisions that seemed to flow in endless supply. Once, when an American sergeant noticed him staring, Kenji quickly stepped back, fearing punishment. Instead, the American smiled and offered him a chocolate bar from his pocket, a casual gesture that left Kenji stunned for hours afterward. In Manila, Kenji confided to Ichiro one evening as they sat on their bunks, "We were told to gather grasshoppers to supplement our rations. Officers received small portions of dried fish, while common soldiers ate roots dug from the jungle. We fought on empty stomachs for weeks." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Here, they throw away more food in a day than many of our units saw in a month. How can this be the same war?" This question echoed through barracks conversations, whispered between bunks long after lights out. The differences weren't limited to quantity, but extended to variety and quality. On Sundays, the camp kitchen prepared special meals: roast chicken, ice cream, cake, items that many younger prisoners had only heard about but never tasted during Japan's increasingly austere wartime economy. Some older men remembered such foods from peacetime, making the comparison even more painful. Private Masaru Kimura, barely 19 and raised during years of increasing scarcity, stared in disbelief at his first ice cream. "It's cold, sweet milk," he whispered to Ichiro. "I've heard of this," but his voice trailed off as the creamy dessert melted on his tongue, a small pleasure that seemed impossibly decadent in a world at war. Such moments carried more weight than mere indulgence. They were glimpses into a society so wealthy it could afford luxuries even for its enemies. The American diet revealed itself not just in the mess hall, but in the very bodies of their captors. Guards and camp personnel appeared different from Japanese soldiers. Taller, heavier, with a robust health that came from lifelong good nutrition. Even the African American and Hispanic guards, whom Japanese propaganda had described as oppressed minorities, showed the same well-fed appearance. This physical evidence was harder to dismiss than any spoken claim could have been. One morning, during a routine medical check, a Japanese medic who had been allowed to assist the American doctors remarked quietly, "Their bones are different from ours, denser, stronger. Their teeth are better. These are not signs of a starving nation." The observation spread quickly among the prisoners, adding another layer to their confusion. If America could produce such physically superior soldiers while fighting a global war, what did that say about the true balance of power? Food waste became another shock to the system. 日本のミリタリーカルチャーでは、leaving even a grain of rice uneaten was considered shameful, a dishonor to those who had produced it, and to comrades who might go without. Yet in the American mess hall, guards and prisoners alike sometimes left food on their plates, which was then scraped into garbage cans. The first time Ichiro witnessed this, he nearly intervened, so ingrained was his horror at seeing food discarded. One elderly prisoner from rural Hokkaido actually retrieved bread crusts from a waste bin, unable to bear seeing them thrown away, only to be gently but firmly corrected by a guard. Even their garbage would be a feast in some places I've served, Captain Matsumoto observed bitterly. The captain had maintained his dignity and distance since arrival, attempting to preserve military discipline among the prisoners. But even he couldn't hide his surprise when the camp commandant announced that the following week would feature Steak Night, a special meal to mark Independence Day. The very concept that captives would receive luxury food to celebrate their captor's national holiday struck many as surreal. Yet when the day arrived, each prisoner indeed received a portion of grilled beef, potatoes with butter, green vegetables, and chocolate pudding. For Ichiro, watching his fellow prisoners that evening revealed something profound. Men who had once been willing to die for the emperor now sat with heads bowed over American steaks, their former certainties dissolved in the face of this abundant reality. In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the camp, a quiet, collective realization that perhaps their sacrifice had been built on foundations less solid than they'd believed. As summer heat intensified across the Mississippi landscape, this realization would deepen into questions none had dared voice before. If America could afford to feed its enemies this well, what did that reveal about the true nature of the conflict they had been fighting? The answers would prove more complex and more disturbing than any of them could have anticipated. In July, the routine of camp life settled into a rhythm that many prisoners found increasingly difficult to reconcile with their previous understanding of captivity. Roll calls, work assignments, and most notably, the steady cycle of meals continued uninterrupted. Even as news reached the camp of intensified bombing campaigns against Japan, American supply chains to the prisoner facility remained unaffected. On particularly hot days, the mess hall served cold plates, sliced meat, cheese, potato salad, fresh vegetables, and fruit. Ice cream appeared with increasing frequency, a luxury that many prisoners had never experienced before captivity. In Okinawa, whispered an older prisoner who had served in the island campaigns, "We drank from puddles when supplies couldn't reach us. Here, they worry we might become dehydrated in the heat." The observation carried no mockery, only bewilderment. These Americans, who could direct such resources toward prisoner comfort, seemed to operate from an entirely different understanding of what war meant. During a work detail repairing camp buildings, Ichiro noticed that American supplies continued to arrive uninterrupted, despite the intense summer heat that slowed all other activities. Trucks delivered fresh food daily. The camp's massive kitchens, industrial operations with stainless steel equipment, walk-in refrigerators, and ovens larger than some Japanese family homes, never paused in their production of meals. When Ichiro was assigned to kitchen duty, he witnessed firsthand the scale of the operation: 50-pound sacks of flour, enormous vats of soup, whole sides of beef hanging in cold storage rooms. The kitchen manager, a broad-shouldered sergeant named Miller, seemed to take pride in the operation's efficiency. 3,000 meals a day, on schedule, every time, he declared to no one in particular as he supervised the preparation of beef stew. What struck Ichiro wasn't just the quantity, but the casual certainty with which Miller approached this logistical challenge, as though feeding thousands of men 3 full meals daily was simply a matter of following established procedures rather than a miracle of supply. In one corner of the kitchen, Ichiro discovered a sight that crystallized the difference between American and Japanese military realities. A trash can nearly full of meat trimmings, fat, gristle, and odd-shaped pieces cut away to ensure the stew contained only the best portions. The discarded meat, though deemed unsuitable for the prisoner's meal, represented more protein than many Japanese civilians saw in a week. Ichiro stood transfixed before this evidence of American excess until another worker nudged him back to his task of peeling potatoes. That evening, Ichiro shared what he had seen with a small group of trusted prisoners. Sergeant Yamamoto shook his head in disbelief. "I commanded men who fought for days on a handful of rice," he said. "We told ourselves hunger made us stronger, more disciplined than our enemies. But how can discipline compete with this?" He gestured around him, indicating not just the food, but the entire apparatus of American material superiority. A young private named Ishida, who had remained fiercely loyal to imperial doctrines despite captivity, bristled at the implication. "Our spirit is stronger," he insisted. "Americans are soft. They need their comforts." "We are willing to sacrifice." The words hung in the air, sounding hollow in the well-ventilated barracks where full stomachs had become the norm. No one directly challenged him, but the silence that followed spoke volumes. Dr. Nakamura, a former naval physician, now permitted to assist with basic medical care among the prisoners, offered a different perspective. The human body requires approximately 2,000 calories daily for basic functions, he explained quietly. In our last months on Peleliu, many men received less than half that. It wasn't bravery that made us see spots before our eyes or made our wounds heal slowly. It was malnutrition. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Here, I estimate we receive nearly 3,000 calories daily. It's not kindness, it's science. They understand this, and somehow, despite fighting a global war, they have the resources to apply this knowledge even to prisoners. The doctor's clinical assessment landed with the weight of forbidden truth. If American abundance wasn't merely luxury but a calculated approach to human maintenance, then Japanese deprivation wasn't noble sacrifice but a failure of provision, a failure that had cost lives and effectiveness long before any battle began. What did victory mean when one side fought with half-empty stomachs against an enemy so well supplied they could afford to feed their captives better than Japan fed its own soldiers? As these questions rippled through the prisoner population, camp authorities introduced another shock to the system, a 4th of July celebration with a special meal. Though few Japanese prisoners understood the significance of the holiday, the announcement that they would receive barbecued ribs, corn on the cob, potato salad, watermelon, and ice cream seemed almost absurd in its generosity. Some prisoners initially refused to participate, viewing the meal as cultural imperialism or a trick designed to humiliate them. But when the day arrived, the smells wafting from the mess hall proved too tempting for most. Captain Matsumoto, who had maintained his military bearing throughout captivity, found himself confronting a plate piled high with more food than he had seen at once in years. "This is their tradition," he said stiffly to those seated near him. "We observe it out of respect for our hosts." But the justification sounded thin even to his own ears. As he took his first bite of barbecued rib, the meat falling from the bone with barely a touch, his expression shifted from reluctant curiosity to something approaching wonder. Across the mess hall, hundreds of Japanese prisoners experienced similar moments of culinary revelation. Men who had never tasted such food commented on the sweetness of the corn, the juiciness of the watermelon, the creamy richness of ice cream. For a brief time, the war receded, and they were simply hungry humans encountering new foods. The guards, perhaps sensing this momentary bridge across enemy lines, seemed less vigilant than usual, some even sharing cigarettes with prisoners as they passed. That night, the barracks buzzed with conversations about the meal, about American customs, about the strangeness of being treated to a feast by people they had been trained to see as barbaric enemies. Ichiro lay awake long after lights out, listening to the murmurs around him and pondering a question that had been growing in his mind with increasing urgency. If this was how Americans treated their enemies, what might life be like for their friends? And more disturbingly, what did it say about Japan that its soldiers had been sent to fight and die against a nation with such overwhelming material advantages? The gulf between propaganda and reality yawned wider with each passing day, each abundant meal, each small kindness that contradicted years of indoctrination. The food was no longer just sustenance. It had become a lens through which prisoners were forced to re-examine everything they thought they knew about the war, their enemy, and their own sacrifice. In August, Ichiro was assigned to a work detail on a nearby farm. The agricultural assignment revealed yet another layer of American productive capacity. The farms surrounding Camp Shelby weren't small family plots, but vast operations with mechanized equipment. A single American farmer with tractors and harvesters could manage acreage that would have required dozens of laborers in Japan.
The farmers' barns held not just animals, but machines, milk separators, feed grinders, electrically powered tools that multiplied human efficiency many times over. One farmer, a weathered man named Johnson, who spoke with a southern drawl, showed the prisoners his previous year's yield figures with undisguised pride. The numbers were staggering: thousands of bushels of corn, hundreds of gallons of milk, tons of beef, all produced by his family with minimal hired help. When he learned that several prisoners had been farmers in Japan, he asked about their methods with genuine curiosity. Private Kimura, whose family had farmed a small rice plot outside Kyoto, described their traditional techniques: hand planting, water buffalo for plowing, manual harvesting. Johnson listened intently before responding. "That's how my granddaddy farmed back in the old days."
But here, we can't afford to farm that way. Land is cheap, but time is expensive. The simple statement contained a profound economic lesson that none of the Japanese prisoners had considered before. American abundance stemmed not just from resources, but from a different calculation of value and efficiency. That evening's meal featured roast pork, sweet potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie, a combination that would have marked a festival day in pre-war Japan, but was merely Thursday at Camp Shelby. As they ate, Ichiro noticed a shift in the conversations around him. The initial shock and disbelief had given way to a more complex response, a mixture of appreciation for the food itself and a deeper questioning of what it represented. The prisoners no longer asked, "Why do they feed us so well?" but rather, "How can they afford to feed everyone so well, and what does it mean that we cannot?" Captain Matsumoto, who had maintained his military bearing throughout captivity, seemed particularly troubled by these questions. Once, he had been quick to dismiss American abundance as a sign of decadence, but months of observation had worn away this certainty. In officer training, he confided to a small group one evening, "They taught us that American soldiers were soft, undisciplined, dependent on comforts. We were told our spiritual strength would overcome their material advantages." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But I begin to wonder if hunger is truly a source of strength, or merely a sign of weakness disguised as virtue." The captain's doubt, coming from one who had embodied military discipline, landed heavily among his listeners. If even the officers, the most thoroughly indoctrinated in imperial ideology, what certainties remained? As summer heat gave way to the first hints of autumn, these doubts flourished similarly among the prison population, fed by daily evidence of American capacity and increasingly dire news from the Pacific Front. On August 6 and 9, 1945, the world changed forever with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. News reached Camp Shelby gradually, first through guarded whispers among the American staff, then through official announcements. The scale of destruction described was so vast, so unprecedented, that many prisoners initially refused to believe it. How could a single bomb destroy an entire city? It seemed like another piece of propaganda, too outlandish to be true. Yet the demeanor of the American guards, somber, subdued, some even visibly shaken, suggested something truly catastrophic had occurred. That evening's meal, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and chocolate cake, seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of such devastating news. Some prisoners refused to eat, either from grief or as a belated gesture of resistance. Others ate mechanically, minds elsewhere. A few wept openly, cultural prohibitions against showing emotion crumbling under the weight of national disaster. They feed us chicken while our cities burn, Private Kimura said bitterly, pushing away his untouched plate. The young soldier, once eager to prove his loyalty to imperial ideals, had grown increasingly disillusioned as captivity stretched on. What kind of enemy does this? Dr. Nakamura, who had lost his normally calm demeanor upon hearing the news of Hiroshima, where his family lived, offered a perspective that silenced the table. They feed us well because it is efficient, because their system is designed to function this way regardless of circumstances. The same industrial capacity that produces this abundance also produced those bombs. He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We are not witnessing kindness. We are witnessing power. Power so vast it can afford to be humane, even while it is terrible. The doctor's words crystallized what many had been feeling but couldn't articulate. The meals, the medical care, the well-ventilated barracks, these weren't acts of charity, but demonstrations of capability. America didn't feed its prisoners well because of moral superiority, but because its productive systems were so robust that doing so required minimal effort. The same nation that could afford meat for captives could also afford to develop weapons that destroyed cities in an instant. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement reached Camp Shelby. Though many prisoners had anticipated this outcome, the reality of defeat landed heavily. That day's lunch went largely uneaten as men struggled to process the unthinkable, Japan's unconditional surrender, the end of the empire as they had known it, the collapse of everything they had been raised to believe was inviolable. The camp authorities, perhaps understanding the psychological impact, made no attempt to force prisoners to maintain normal routines that day. Men gathered in small groups, some arguing fiercely, others sitting in stunned silence. A few ultranationalists refused to accept the news, insisting it must be American propaganda. Most, however, recognized the inevitable truth they had been witnessing in microcosm throughout their captivity. Japan had challenged a nation whose material superiority was so overwhelming that the outcome had perhaps been determined before the first shot was fired. That evening, the mess hall served a particularly American meal: hamburgers, French fries, corn on the cob, and apple pie. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate symbolism remained unclear, but the timing gave the familiar food a different significance. Ichiro, entering the line mechanically, found himself recalling his first meal in captivity, the shock of abundance, the suspicion, the disbelief. Now, hundreds of meals later, what had once seemed extraordinary had become routine, expected, normal. As he collected his tray, an older American officer Ichiro hadn't seen before was observing the serving line. The man caught Ichiro's eye and nodded slightly. "Things will change now," he said in accented but understandable Japanese. "War's over. You men will be going home when transportation can be arranged." Home. The word landed with complex emotions. What home remained after the bombing campaigns, the fire raids, the atomic weapons? What would they find upon return? And how would they explain what they had witnessed here? The abundance that contradicted everything they had been told. The enemy who fed them better than their own military had. Sergeant Yamamoto articulated these concerns that night as prisoners sat outside their barracks looking up at the stars. "How do we tell them?" he asked quietly. "How do we explain that we ate meat every day while they starved? That our captors treated us better than our own officers? That everything we were taught about America was wrong?" No one had answers. The coming weeks brought new routines as the camp began processing prisoners for eventual repatriation. Medical examinations, paperwork, information sessions about the occupation of Japan, activities that filled time while they waited for transport to be arranged. Throughout it all, the mess hall continued serving 3 meals daily: meat at dinner and lunch, fresh fruit, vegetables, desserts. Even in victory, American abundance remained constant, systematic, unremarkable to the givers, but unforgettable to the recipients. In October, as the first groups of prisoners prepared for departure, the camp commandant authorized a special meal, a farewell dinner that showcased American cuisine. The tables in the mess hall were covered with white cloths, an unheard-of luxury. The menu featured steak, baked potatoes with butter and sour cream, fresh corn, green salad, rolls, and a choice of apple or cherry pie with ice cream. The commandant, a middle-aged colonel with combat ribbons, addressed the assembled prisoners through a translator. His speech was brief, practical, focused on the logistics of repatriation rather than politics or victory declarations. Yet one phrase stood out. "When you return to Japan, you'll be rebuilding your country. Remember what you've seen here. Not just the food or comfort, but the systems that make them possible." There are many ways to be strong. That night, Ichiro wrote in the small diary he had maintained throughout captivity. His entry was simple: "Final American dinner. Steak, potato, pie. Tomorrow we begin the journey home. I am returning with more weight, more health, and less certainty than when I arrived. What kind of defeat leaves the vanquished stronger than they were in victory? What kind of victory allows the victor to feed its enemies as if they were guests?" 3 days later, Ichiro boarded a transport ship along with hundreds of other former prisoners. As the Mississippi coastline receded, he found himself thinking not of battles or bombs or surrender ceremonies, but of meals. Hundreds of meals that had steadily, systematically dismantled everything he thought he knew about America, about Japan, about strength and weakness, abundance and scarcity. Each plate had carried not just nutrients, but a powerful, unanswerable argument about the true nature of the conflict they had fought. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself and developed its own economic miracle, Ichiro would sometimes visit American-style restaurants that began appearing in Tokyo and Osaka. Sitting in these establishments, watching Japanese families enjoy hamburgers and milkshakes, he would remember those mess hall trays at Camp Shelby. The daily meat, the fresh vegetables, the casual abundance that had once seemed so alien and had now become an aspirational symbol of modern life. He never told most people about his time as a prisoner. Those who hadn't experienced it couldn't understand the profound dissonance, how captivity in America had offered better nutrition than freedom in wartime Japan, how surrender had provided lessons more valuable than resistance could have. But occasionally, sharing a meal with fellow veterans who had known similar camps, he would raise his glass in a quiet toast to the meat they served every day. The others would nod, understanding that he wasn't commemorating just food, but the collapse of one worldview and the painful birth of another. A transformation that began with the shock of a filled plate when emptiness had been expected, and ended with a nation rebuilding itself in the image of what it had once feared most. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have your deepest beliefs unraveled, not by propaganda or defeat, but by something as simple as a daily meal? In the quiet corners of history, between the headlines of battles and treaties, lie human moments of realization that sometimes change more than any bomb or bullet could. Perhaps in these small, overlooked stories of confusion and revelation, we might find lessons about how nations truly understand one another, not through speeches or declarations, but through the most basic acts of humanity, like the sharing of daily bread.